I was on my way to my son's place for Sunday dinner when I stopped at the Loblaws on Merivale Road to pick up a bottle of Shiraz and some fresh bread. Nothing unusual about that. I had done it 100 times before. I knew every aisle, every cashier, every squeaky wheel on the cart by the entrance. It was the kind of errand that barely registers in your memory because it is so ordinary, so safe, so completely without consequence. But that evening, somewhere between the wine section and the bakery, my ordinary Sunday changed forever. I was reaching for a sourdough loaf when I heard my name. Dorothy? I turned around. Standing there with a basket over her arm and snow still melting on her coat collar was Pauline Tremblay. We had been neighbors for nearly 11 years on Carling Avenue before I moved to a smaller place in Nepean after my husband passed. Pauline and I used to share a fence, a bottle of wine on summer evenings, and the kind of easy friendship that doesn't require much maintenance. We hadn't seen each other in almost 2 years. "Pauline," I said, and I genuinely smiled. "Look at you. How are you?" She smiled back, but something was off about it. It reached her mouth, but not quite her eyes. She hugged me, and when she pulled back, she held onto both my hands and didn't let go right away. "I'm well," she said. "Dorothy, are you still close with your son? With Marcus?" The way she asked it, careful and low, like she was checking who was standing nearby, made something shift in my chest. "Of course," I said. "I'm actually heading there tonight. Why?" She looked down at my hands, then back up at me. "There's something you should know," she said, "about his wife. I want to stop here for a moment and tell you something about how I felt in that exact second, because it matters. My daughter-in-law, Renee, had been part of our family for 6 years. Marcus had met her at a work conference in Montreal, and they had married the following spring in a small ceremony at a vineyard in Prince Edward County. She was 34 years old, sharp, well-dressed, always polite to me in the careful way that kept a certain distance. I had never been able to fully reach her, but I had never suspected anything, not once. So when Pauline said those words, my first instinct was not alarm. It was confusion. "What do you mean?" I asked. Pauline glanced around again. Then she said quietly, "I saw her, Dorothy, 3 weeks ago, at the Marriott on Kent Street. I was there for a work luncheon. She was in the lobby with a man, and the way they were together, it wasn't a business meeting. She had her hand on his arm. He had his hand at her back. They were checking in." I stared at her. "Are you sure it was Renee?" I asked. "I've sat across from her at your son's dining table," Pauline said. "I'm sure. I drove to Marcus's house that night, and I sat through dinner, and I smiled, and I passed the salad, and I told Renee the chicken was wonderful. And I watched her. I watched the way she laughed at her own jokes, the way she refreshed her own wine glass before anyone else's, the way she barely looked at my son for the whole evening. And I thought about what Pauline had told me in that grocery store, and I felt something cold settle into my bones that no amount of warm food could touch. I did not say a word that night. I have been 63 years old for 4 months now. I am a retired school principal. For 31 years I managed staff, handled parent complaints, mediated conflicts, and made decisions that affected real children's real lives. I know how to stay calm. I know how to think before I speak. And I knew, driving home on the 417 inches the dark, that the worst thing I could do for my son was say something before I knew exactly what I was dealing with. So I did not explode. I made a plan. The first thing I did was call my friend Carol, who had gone through a divorce herself 8 years ago and knew a private investigator in the glebe. His name was Robert Fife. Not a glamorous operation, just a quiet man who worked out of a home office and had 30 years of experience. I met him for coffee at a Williams on Bank Street, and I explained what I knew. He listened without interrupting. Then he told me what he could find out and how long it would take and what it would cost. I wrote him a check the same afternoon. I want to be clear about something. I did not hire Robert because I wanted to destroy Renee or blow up my son's marriage. I hired him because I loved my son, and I could not hand him a grenade without first making sure it was real. Marcus was 40 years old. He had built a life with this woman. He deserved evidence, not a mother's suspicion based on a grocery store conversation. Robert came back to me in 11 days. He had photographs. He had dates. He had the man's name, a real estate developer from Gatineau named Sébastien Viau, 46. Divorced. He had documentation of 17 separate meetings over the previous 4 months. He had a hotel receipt. He also had something I had not anticipated. Financial records showing that Renee had recently opened a personal investment account, separate from any joint accounts she and Marcus held, and had transferred into it approximately $38,000 over the preceding 8 months. Money Marcus did not know about. Money that had not come from her salary. I sat in my kitchen with that folder in front of me, and I put my hands flat on the table and I breathed. My son's wife was not just unfaithful, she was preparing to leave, and she was making sure she had enough money to do it comfortably, on her own timeline, while Marcus sat in his own home, believing everything was fine. The question of what to do next was the hardest one I have ever faced, and I have faced some hard ones. I called my older sister, Helen, who lives in Victoria and who has always been the clearest thinker I know. I told her everything. There was a long silence on the line. "You have to tell him," Helen said. "I know," I said. "And you have to do it gently," she said, "because the first thing he's going to feel is not anger at her. It's going to be humiliation. And the second thing he's going to feel is embarrassment that his mother knew before he did." Helen was right, as she usually is. I had to think about not just what I was telling Marcus, but how I was going to hand him something that would break his heart without breaking him. I called him and asked if he would come for lunch that Saturday. Just the two of us. I told him I needed to talk about something to do with the house, a plumbing issue I wanted his advice on. He said, of course, "Mom, no problem." He showed up at noon with a bag of Tim Hortons and his easy smile, and for about 10 minutes we talked about the bathroom pipes and drank coffee, and it was completely normal. Then I said, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear me out before you say anything." He put down his cup. I told him about Pauline. I told him about Robert Fife. I slid the folder across the table and watched my son's face go through every stage of grief in the space of about 90 seconds. First, confusion, then a kind of searching look, like he was trying to find the error. Then, something that went very quiet and very still behind his eyes. He looked at the photographs for a long time, without saying a word. When he finally spoke, he said, "How long have you known?" 11 days since I had confirmation, I said. About 2 weeks before that, I had suspicion. I didn't say anything until I was sure. He nodded slowly. Then he said, "She's been saying she's working late." "I know. Every Thursday." "I know, sweetheart." He put the photographs face down on the table. He stood up and walked to the window, and stood there with his back to me for a while. I let him. I did not try to fill the silence. Some silences need to be sat in. Then he said, "The money." "Yes," I said. "She's been planning this. That's what it looks like." He turned around, and his face had settled into something I had not seen before on my son. A kind of hardness. Not anger exactly. More like clarity. Like a man deciding something. "I need to call a lawyer," he said. "I already looked up a few names," I told him. "Family law. Good ones. I can text you the list." He looked at me for a moment. "Mum," he said, "how are you so calm right now?" "I'm not calm," I said. "I'm a retired school principal. There's a difference." He almost laughed. Almost. I will not pretend the weeks that followed were easy. They were not. Marcus hired a lawyer, a woman named Patricia Okafor, at a firm on Elgin Street, who came highly recommended, and who, by all accounts, was extremely good at her job. He said nothing to Renee initially. Patricia advised him to document everything, to protect himself financially, and to proceed carefully, given the money that had already been moved. What followed was one of the most difficult periods I have experienced in my role as a mother. Because being a mother in a situation like this does not mean swooping in and fixing everything. It means making yourself available without making yourself a burden. It means answering your phone at 11 o'clock at night and being steady on the other end. It means not saying "I knew something was wrong with her" even when you want to, because that does not help your son. It only makes you feel better. Marcus confronted Renee about 3 weeks after our lunch. He told me later that she was not apologetic. She was defensive, and then she was cold. She admitted to Sebastian Viau, without much resistance, as though she had already made her peace with it. She denied any intention to hide the money. That part she fought harder on, probably because it had legal implications. The marriage, she said, had not been working for some time. She said this as though it were a shared conclusion they had arrived at together, rather than a secret she had been keeping while decorating their living room and attending his work Christmas party and sitting at my Sunday dinner table with her careful smile. They filed for separation before Christmas. Marcus stayed with me for 2 weeks in November. We watched hockey and made too much pasta, and I let him talk when he wanted to talk and be quiet when he needed that instead. He is a strong person, my son. Stronger than he probably realizes. But strong people still need somewhere to land. Here is the part of this story I did not see coming. Renee's mother, a woman named Colette Beaumont, called me in December. Colette was 68, widowed, and had been living in a retirement apartment in Orleans for the past 2 years. She and I had met a handful of times over the years at family gatherings, and we had always been pleasant with each other. I did not know her well. She called to apologize. "I am so sorry," she said, in her accented English, and she sounded genuinely shaken. "I knew my daughter's marriage was in trouble. She told me some things. I should have said something. I don't know to who. But I should have said something. I listened to her. I told her she didn't need to apologize to me. I meant it." We talked for almost an hour. It turned out that Colette had not spoken to Renee since the separation became known in the family, and that several of Renee's siblings were not speaking to her either. Colette was alone in a way that had very little to do with living in a small apartment. She was an old woman whose family had fractured, sitting by herself at Christmas time. I talked to Marcus about it. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "She was always decent to me, Colette. This wasn't her fault." We invited Colette for Christmas Eve dinner. She brought wine and a bûche de Noël, and she cried a little when she came through the door and saw Marcus. And Marcus hugged her and told her she was welcome. My sister Helen was there from Victoria. It was a strange and tender evening that I will remember for a long time. Colette came to Marcus's birthday in February. She has become, in the quiet and unexpected way that life sometimes moves, something like a fixture at our table. She and I have had coffee 3 times since Christmas. She is funny and direct, and she misses her husband, who died of cancer in 2019. We have that in common. Marcus is doing better. Not healed, that takes longer than a few months, and anyone who tells you otherwise is selling something, but better. He has started running again. He has seen his friends more. He called me last week just to talk, not because he was struggling, just to check in, and when that started happening again, I knew he was finding his footing. The separation agreement was finalized last month. Patricia Okafor is, indeed, very good at her job. The financial question was resolved in Marcus's favor. Renee has moved to Gatineau. I don't ask about her, and Marcus doesn't offer. I have thought a lot about that moment in the Loblaws on Merivale Road, standing there with a sourdough loaf in my hand, while Pauline Tremblay held onto my hands and lowered her voice. I have thought about how easy it would have been for her to say nothing, to think it wasn't her place, to decide it was too complicated and too risky, and let it be somebody else's problem. She didn't do that. She took the discomfort of saying something hard to someone she hadn't seen in 2 years because she thought it was the right thing to do. I called Pauline in January to thank her properly. She told me she had lost sleep about it, wondering if she had done the right thing. I told her she had. I told her she had given my son the chance to face the truth before things got worse, and that no matter how painful the months that followed had been, knowing is always better than not knowing. She seemed relieved to hear it. There are things I would tell any parent who finds themselves in a situation like this one. The first is, do not react immediately. The impulse to protect your child is powerful and right, but acting on it before you have the full picture can do more harm than the threat itself. Breathe. Think. Verify. The second is, your job is not to make the decision for your child. My job was never to decide what Marcus should do about his marriage. My job was to make sure he had the information he needed to make that decision himself, with honesty and dignity, rather than being left in the dark while someone else made it for him. The third is, protect yourself too. This kind of thing takes something out of you. I slept badly for weeks. I replayed conversations. I second-guessed my timing. I wondered if I had handled it wrong. You will do this too. It is normal. Talk to someone. Call your sister. Drink tea. Go for a walk by the river. Let yourself feel the weight of it without letting it crush you. The fourth is about the people at the edges. Colette Beaumont did not choose what her daughter did. The people who surround a betrayal are not always complicit in it. Some of them are also hurting. Some of them also deserve a seat at the table, if you can find it in your heart to offer one. I am glad we did. And the last thing I would say is this. Truth almost never arrives at a convenient time, in a convenient place, delivered by the right person in the right way. It showed up for me beside the bread aisle, from a woman in a wet coat, on an ordinary Sunday evening, when I had nothing more complicated on my mind than what wine to bring to dinner. That is usually how it works. And when it arrives, however awkward and unwelcome, you have a choice about what to do with it. You can set it aside and pretend you didn't hear, or you can hold it carefully and figure out, slowly and thoughtfully, what it asks of you. I chose to hold it. I would choose the same thing again. Marcus asked me recently whether I regretted any of it. The PI, the folder on the kitchen table, the Saturday lunch that changed everything. I told him the only thing I had ever regretted was the weeks I spent not knowing, sitting at his dinner table, smiling at a woman who was quietly planning her exit while my son poured her wine. He nodded. Then he said, "Thanks, Mum." That was enough.